Have you ever wondered what people hide when no one's watching? The kind of secrets they bury so deep, they only dare to whisper them in the darkest corners of the internet. I stumbled across a hidden forum, a space where people pour out their darkest secrets. They're unfiltered, raw, and at times, utterly chilling. I've read through them, structured their chaos into something coherent, and now I am bringing them to you. So today, I am inviting you to explore this world with me, a world of raw confessions, unspoken truths, and choices that changed lives forever. These aren't just stories. These are the sins of strangers, shared anonymously in the shadows of the dark web. But let me warn you, these secrets come with weight. Some will haunt you. Some will make you question what people are truly capable of. So, do me a favor, turn off the lights, grab your headphones, and settle in. This isn't just entertainment. It's a journey into the human psyche, one confession at a time. Viewer discretion is advised. These stories will stay with you long after this video ends. Are you ready? Let's begin. I've never told anyone this before, and I am not sure why I'm saying it now. Maybe because I am tired of carrying it. Maybe because, after all these years, I am finally starting to realize how much of my life has been shaped by what I did that day. I sabotaged my sister's wedding, and because of me, she died. Carly was the perfect sister. At least, that's how everyone saw her. She was the golden child, beautiful, kind, always good at everything she tried. Where I was awkward and quiet, Carly was radiant and confident. Teachers loved her. Boys adored her. Even strangers seemed to gravitate toward her. I loved her too, but I also resented her. I hated always being in her shadow, always being the other sister. No matter how hard I tried, I was never enough. When Carly got engaged, it was like the whole world stopped to celebrate her. My parents were over the moon, throwing her a lavish engagement party, talking non-stop about the wedding. Her fiancé, Daniel, was everything you'd expect. Handsome, charming, wealthy. It was like Carly's life was ripped straight out of a fairy tale. And I was just the plain, invisible sister standing in the background. I told myself I was happy for her, and I was, in a way. But the bitterness kept growing, creeping into my thoughts like poison. The morning of her wedding, something inside me snapped. It started small. I was supposed to help Carly get ready, do her makeup, make sure everything was perfect. But instead, I accidentally spilled foundation on her dress. She freaked out, of course, but the wedding planner found a way to clean it up. She looked upset for a while, but everyone reassured her it was fine, and she moved on. That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Later, as the ceremony got closer, I overheard the venue staff talking about the decorations. Carly had chosen this massive floral archway for the altar, with layers of hanging greenery and heavy white roses. It was gorgeous, but fragile. One of the staff mentioned it had to be adjusted carefully, or it could topple over. I don't know what came over me. I wasn't even thinking clearly. All I could feel was that old resentment bubbling to the surface. Like a boiling pot, I couldn't stop from spilling over. While everyone was busy, taking pictures or greeting guests, I slipped away. The arch was standing there ready for the ceremony. I walked up to it, reached out, and loosened one of the supports. It only took a second. I didn't plan what happened next. I swear, I didn't. The ceremony went on as planned. Carly walked down the aisle, smiling like a queen, while Daniel waited for her under that stupid arch. Everyone was crying, cheering, taking pictures. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I just wanted her to be embarrassed when it wobbled a little, that's all. But as they exchanged vows, the wind picked up. It was a breezy day, and the arch started swaying more than it should have. People noticed, whispering to each other, but no one moved, not until it was too late. I'll never forget the sound it made when it fell. The arch came crashing down, collapsing on top of Carly and Daniel. The weight of the flowers and the metal frame was too much. I remember screaming, people rushing forward, chaos everywhere. Carly was pinned under the arch, unconscious. Daniel escaped with only a few scratches, but Carly, she didn't wake up. She died in the hospital that night. A piece of the arch had struck her head, causing a traumatic brain injury. The official story was that it was a freak accident. Everyone chalked it up to bad luck, a terrible tragedy no one could have predicted. But I knew the truth. I killed her. I didn't mean to. I swear, I didn't mean for it to happen that way. But I loosened that support. I made it unstable. And because of me, my sister, the perfect golden sister, was dead. The guilt has eaten me alive ever since. I see her face every time I close my eyes. I hear the crash of the arch, the screams of the guests, my mother sobbing in the hospital waiting room. I haven't told anyone what I did, not even my therapist. I don't know if I ever will. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, I visit her grave. I leave flowers, sit by her headstone, and beg for forgiveness. But I don't think she'll ever forgive me. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself. I didn't just ruin her wedding that day, I ruined her life. And mine too. When I first became a therapist, I told myself I was doing it to help people, to make a difference in the lives of those who felt lost, broken, or misunderstood. And for a while, I did. I listened. I empathized. And I helped my clients work through their struggles. But there is another side to being a therapist, one they don't prepare you for in school. The long hours, the emotional toll, the clients who test every ounce of your patience, and sometimes the temptation to let your personal feelings cloud your judgment. It's no excuse for what I did. I know that. But at the time it felt justified. Her name was Rebecca. She came to me for counseling during a messy custody battle with her ex-husband. From the moment she walked into my office, I didn't like her. She was demanding, argumentative, and constantly late for appointments. She'd interrupt me mid-sentence, roll her eyes when I tried to offer advice, and blame everyone else for her problems. Her husband, her parents, even her own children. It was always someone else's fault. I tried to stay professional, to remind myself that she was hurting and needed help. But every session felt like a battle, and the more I learned about her, the less sympathy I had. She talked about her kids like they were burdens, complaining about their tantrums and how much they relied on her. She made veiled comments about how much easier her life would be without them. It wasn't my place to judge, but I couldn't help thinking she wasn't fit to be a mother. Then, one day, she brought up her ex-husband. He wanted full custody of the kids, and she was terrified he'd get it. She asked me to write a letter for the court, a statement supporting her case. She wanted me to testify that she was a loving, capable parent, that her children would be better off with her. I agreed at first. It wasn't unusual for therapists to provide letters, or even testify in custody cases. But as I sat down to write it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying. Rebecca wasn't a loving, capable parent. She was selfish, reckless, and unfit to care for those kids. I tried to push those thoughts aside, to write something neutral and professional. But the more I thought about her smug attitude, her dismissive comments about her children, and the way she treated me like I was beneath her, the angrier I got. And that's when I made my choice. I wrote a different letter. In it, I detailed a fabricated diagnosis, borderline personality disorder, severe enough to interfere with her ability to parent. I described her as volatile, unpredictable, and emotionally unstable, painting a picture of someone who couldn't provide a safe or nurturing environment for her children. It was convincing. Too convincing. When Rebecca found out, she was furious. She accused me of sabotaging her case, of lying to the court. I denied everything, of course. I told her it was my professional assessment, based on the information she'd shared with me during our sessions. She stormed out of my office and never came back. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that the court had ruled in her ex-husband's favor. He got full custody of the kids, and Rebecca was granted limited visitation rights. At first, I felt relieved. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that those kids would be better off with their father. But then the guilt started creeping in. What if I'd been wrong about her? What if she really had loved her kids, but just didn't know how to express it? What if she was trying to change, and I'd taken away her chance to prove it? I started looking into her case, following her on social media, searching for any mention of her or her children. What I found wasn't what I expected. Her ex-husband wasn't the hero I'd imagined. There were rumors of neglect, of drinking problems, of fights with his new girlfriend. And Rebecca, she looked broken. Every post, every photo, every update screamed of someone who'd lost everything. She'd post old pictures of her kids, captioned with messages like, "I miss you more than words can say." I wanted to believe she deserved it, that I'd done the right thing. But the truth is, I'll never know. What I do know is that I crossed the line. I let my personal feelings dictate my actions, and I used my position as a therapist to punish someone who trusted me. I told myself it was for the kids, but really, it was about me, my ego, my frustration, my need to feel in control. I still see her face sometimes. When I close my eyes, I see the moment she realized what I'd done, the betrayal and rage in her eyes. And I hear her voice, trembling as she begged me to reconsider. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it's in the past. But it's not. It never will be, because no matter how I spin it, no matter how I try to justify it, I know the truth. I didn't just ruin Rebecca's life. I ruined her children's too. I was 19 when it happened. It's been over a decade, and I've built a life far from that town, far from the people I knew then, far from the secrets I left behind. But sometimes when I am lying awake at night, the memories come rushing back. I was a babysitter, not full-time, just a few afternoons and evenings a week for a family that seemed perfect from the outside. The McAllisters lived in a big house on the nice side of town. Laura, the mom, was a type A perfectionist who baked cookies from scratch and hosted book clubs in a spotless living room. She always looked polished, even when she was running late. Jack, the dad, was charming, with a smile that could disarm anyone. He ran his own business, always busy, but somehow managing to make time for his family. Or so it seemed. And then there was Liam, their 4-year-old son. Liam was sweet, shy, and a little clingy. He loved dinosaurs and bedtime stories, always asking for one more hug before I tucked him in. He was a good kid, but I didn't love him. I didn't love any of it. The perfect family, the picture, perfect life that felt fake every time I stepped through their door. I hated Laura. She was polite to me, sure, but she had this way of making me feel small, like I was just another tool in her perfectly organized life. I was the babysitter, someone to clean up messes, entertain Liam, and disappear when I wasn't needed. But Jack was different. It started small. He'd linger a little too long when he walked me to the door at the end of the night. Compliments that felt too personal. A hand brushing against mine when he handed me cash for the week. I should have known better, but I was young and stupid and flattered by the attention. Before I knew it, we were sneaking around, meeting in hotel rooms, kissing in the shadows of their back porch after Laura went to bed. He told me things I wanted to hear, that he wasn't happy, that his marriage was falling apart, that he wished he'd met me first. I believed him. I believed every word, even when he'd pull away at the last second, saying he couldn't leave because of Liam. It's for the kid, he'd say over and over. I can't do that to him. At first, I thought he was being noble. But the more I heard it, the angrier I got. It wasn't about Liam, it was about Laura. He wasn't willing to leave her, to shatter their perfect family. And I hated her even more for it. The day it happened, I was supposed to take Liam to the park. It was summer, and Laura was out running errands, as usual. Jack was at work, Liam was playing with his toys, and I was stewing in my own bitterness, thinking about how I'd let myself get trapped in this situation. I don't know when the idea first crept into my mind. Maybe it had been there all along, buried beneath the jealousy and resentment. But when it finally surfaced, it felt like a solution. I dressed Liam in his little sneakers and sun hat, packed him a snack, and walked him to the park like I always did. He held my hand the whole way, babbling about dinosaurs and how he wanted to dig for fossils someday. When we got there, I sat on the bench and watched as he ran toward the playground. He climbed the slide, swung on the monkey bars, laughed when another kid handed him a bucket to fill with sand, and then I looked away. It wasn't long. A few minutes, maybe less. When I looked up again, he was gone. I didn't panic, not at first. I told myself he'd just wandered off to another part of the park. Walked around, calling his name, pretending to look for him, but deep down, I knew what I was doing. I left the park without him. I walked home slowly, my heart pounding, rehearsing what I would say. By the time I got back to the McAllister's house, Laura was already there, pacing in the driveway, her phone pressed to her ear. She saw me and rushed over, frantic. "W here is Liam?" she asked. I froze, then let the words tumble out. "I don't know." I looked away for a second, and he was gone. I've been looking everywhere. The rest of the day was a blur. Police. Neighbors searching. Laura sobbing in Jack's arms. I stayed quiet, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea someone handed me, doing my best to look as distraught as everyone else. Liam's body was found 3 days later. He'd fallen into a drainage ditch a few blocks from the park and drowned. The police ruled it an accident, saying he must have wandered off on his own. No one blamed me. Not out loud, anyway. The funeral was unbearable. Laura was a shell of herself. And Jack wouldn't even look at me. In town for another week. But it was clear I wasn't welcome anymore. I left, changed my number, and started over somewhere new. I've thought about confessing, but what would it change? No one would believe me. They'd say it was an accident, that I couldn't have known what would happen. But I did. I might not have known the specifics, but I knew enough. I let him go. I let him die, because I was angry and selfish. I wanted to hurt them the way they'd hurt me. And I succeeded. I ruined their family, but I ruined myself too. Liam's face still haunts me. I see him in my dreams, in the faces of kids I pass on the street, in the little sneakers they wear. I wonder what kind of person he would have grown up to be, what kind of life he could have had. But I'll never know. Because of me, he never got the chance. I've been driving rideshare for the better part of a decade. It started as a side hustle, something to cover the bills between jobs, but I got comfortable with it. The hours were flexible, and the money wasn't bad if you worked the right areas. I've picked up all kinds of people over the years. Business people heading to the airport, drunk college kids, barely able to hold their tacos, tourists with cameras hanging around their necks. Most of them were forgettable, just faces in the rearview mirror, but not all of them. When you drive long enough, you learn the city, inside and out, every street and back alley. You learn the good neighborhoods, the bad ones, and the ones you wouldn't set foot in even during the day. I avoided those areas at first, but then I learned something. Danger isn't always bad for business. Sometimes it's lucrative. It started small, like these things always do. One night, I got flagged down outside a dive bar. A guy in his mid-30s, rough around the edges, leaned into my window and asked if I could take him a couple of blocks over. "I'll give you $50 cash," he said, waving the bill at me. The address he gave me was in a part of town I wouldn't usually go to, but $50 was $50. I didn't ask questions. I dropped him off, pocketed the cash, and moved on. A few weeks later, I picked up another guy near the same area. This one was older, wearing a hoodie and a chain around his neck. He didn't use the app, just waved me down from the curb. As soon as he got in, he leaned forward and said, "You want to make some real money?" I laughed it off, told him I was just a driver. But he didn't back off. He handed me $100 bill and said, "All you gotta do is bring me the kind who don't belong around here." I should have said no. I should have kicked him out of my car and never gone back to that neighborhood. But I didn't. $100 was a lot of money for me back then. And I wasn't stupid enough to ask what he meant by don't belong. It wasn't hard to figure out, though. Tourists, mostly. People with accents, or cameras, or that wide-eyed look that screamed, "I don't know where I am." They'd get into my car, smiling and friendly, thinking I was just a nice guy taking them to their hotel or the nearest bar. But I wasn't. I'd take a detour. Maybe pretend there was construction on their route, or that traffic was bad. I'd tell them it was a shortcut, or that it'd get them there faster, and then I'd drop them off in a neighborhood they wouldn't last 5 minutes in. I knew what was waiting for them. I knew who was waiting for them. The thugs who paid me didn't make it a secret. They'd told me outright that they were looking for easy marks, people who wouldn't fight back, people who wouldn't call the cops because they didn't even know where they were, and I let it happen. Over and over again. At first, I told myself it wasn't that bad. I wasn't the one robbing them, after all. I wasn't hurting anyone. I was just driving. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Every time I saw one of those tourists get out of my car, looking around nervously, I knew I was feeding them to the wolves. It wasn't just robberies either. I don't know everything that happened to the people I'd off, but I heard enough to piece it together. A couple from out of state ended up in the hospital, beaten so badly they couldn't even describe their attackers. A college kid went missing after I left him on a corner late at night. His parents plastered his face on missing posters all over the city, but they never found him. And then there was the woman. She was in her 20s, visiting from out of town, bubbly and chatty in the back seat. She told me she was here for a conference and asked me for restaurant recommendations. I didn't say much. I just smiled, nodded, and kept driving. When we got to the drop-off point, she hesitated. "This doesn't look like the hotel," she said. I lied, told her the entrance was around the corner, as she'd see it once she started walking. She looked at me for a long moment, like she didn't believe me. But then she got out. I don't know what happened to her. I don't want to know. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. The money wasn't worth it. I told the guys who'd been paying me that I was done, that I didn't want any trouble, but they just laughed. "You were already in it," one of them said. They were right. Even now, years later, I can't escape it. Every time I see a tourist in my city, I wonder if I ruined their life. Every time I hear about someone getting mugged or disappearing in one of those neighborhoods, I wonder if it's because of me. I've tried to make up for it in little ways. I volunteer now, donating time and money to local shelters and organizations that help victims of violence. But it doesn't feel like enough. It'll never be enough. I keep thinking about the people I dropped off, the ones who never made it home. I wonder if they had families waiting for them, if anyone ever figured out what happened to them. The worst part is, no one knows what I did. Not the police, not my friends, not my family. I've kept it buried, trying to convince myself that it's in the past, but it's not. It never will be. I took those people to hell and left them there. Something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. When I was 24, I worked at a funeral home. It wasn't a job I ever planned on having, but it paid the bills, and honestly, I didn't mind it. I liked the quiet, the routine, and the feeling that I was helping people in their worst moments. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt meaningful in a strange way. The job came with its share of weirdness, though. After a while, you got desensitized to things most people would find horrifying, like dressing bodies, seeing autopsy scars, or handling someone's ashes. Some of the guys I worked with leaned into that dark humor, and I guess I did too. It was a coping mechanism, a way to make the unthinkable feel normal. I'll never forget Mike, one of my co-workers. He was about 10 years older than me, and had been in the business forever. Mike was a prankster, the kind of guy who always had a smart remark or a dumb joke to lighten the mood. He could be inappropriate, sure, but at the time, I didn't see the harm in it. One of Mike's favorite pranks was swapping bodies in caskets. It was never anything public, just small, private switches in the back room, usually before a cremation or a closed casket service. It sounds awful, I know, but back then, it didn't feel like a big deal. The families never knew, and it wasn't like we were hurting anyone. At least, that's what I told myself. I remember the night it happened. It was late, and we were prepping 2 bodies. One for cremation, the other for a closed casket funeral the next day. The cremation was scheduled for the morning, so Mike thought it would be hilarious to swap them. Just to mess with the new guy who's working the service tomorrow. The cremation tag went on the wrong body, and the funeral tag went on the other. I didn't think twice about it. I laughed, shook my head, and helped him finish the prep. By the next morning, the cremation was done, and the prank was over. We never talked about it again. Years passed. I left the funeral home and moved on to a different career, one that didn't involve death or pranks, or the kind of guilt that keeps you up at night. For a long time, I barely thought about those days. Then, a few months ago, I saw a news story that stopped me cold. A notorious serial killer, Raymond Fitch, had finally been identified after decades of speculation. He'd terrorized our area in the late 80s and early 90s, killing at least 7 women, though police suspected there were more. The news report detailed how DNA evidence had linked him to the crimes, but there was one glaring issue. They couldn't locate his body. He died in 2008 of a heart attack, the report said. His death certificate listed a local funeral home, my old workplace. I froze when I read that. The year, the timeline, the description of his death, it all clicked. I remembered his face. Raymond Fitch had been one of the bodies Mike and I worked on that night, and I knew exactly what had happened to him. The body we'd tagged for cremation, the one we'd swapped as a joke, was his. I felt sick. I hadn't thought about that night in years, but it all came flooding back. The way we laughed, the casual way we moved tags around, the smell of the crematory as we started the machine the next morning. I didn't know who he was back then. He was just another body, another name on a death certificate. But now I knew the truth. We'd burned the only evidence that could have linked him to those murders. The DNA, the scars, the traces of his crimes, they were all gone because of a stupid, careless prank. The family of the other man, the one we'd put in Fitch's casket, had no idea. They'd buried the wrong body, said goodbye to someone who wasn't even there, and Fitch's victims, the women he tortured and killed, would never get the justice they deserved. I've thought about confessing, but what would it change? The police already know he's dead. His victims' families already know he was the killer. Telling them what happened wouldn't bring their loved ones back. All it would do is drag up more pain, more anger, more questions with no answers. I live with it now, this secret that weighs on me like a stone tied to my chest. I think about those women, about their families, about the other man whose body was buried in Fitch's place. I think about the way we laughed that night so sure it was harmless. It wasn't harmless. It was selfish, stupid, and cruel, and it stole justice from people who deserved it. I can't go back and fix it. All I can do is carry it with me, a reminder of how easy it is to ruin something you don't even realize is fragile. I don't work with the dead anymore, but they haunt me every day, and I deserve it. I've been a doctor for 15 years. People like to say it's a noble profession, and maybe it is, but it's also a job like any other. You get tired, you make mistakes. Sometimes, you cut corners to make it through the day. Most of the cuts don't hurt anyone. But one time they did, and I'll never forget it. I was working the night shift at a busy urban hospital, the kind of place where the waiting room is always full, and the staff is stretched thin. It wasn't unusual for homeless patients to come in, some looking for a warm bed, others desperate for care they couldn't afford anywhere else. Most of the time, they were treated and discharged as quickly as possible. The unspoken rule was to prioritize patients with insurance, the ones who could pay the bills. That night, a man came in with severe abdominal pain. His clothes were filthy, his face gone, and his breath reeked of alcohol. He couldn't give me a name, just grunted and curled up on the gurney, clutching his stomach. We didn't have a lot of information to go on. No ID, no medical history, no one to call for details. He was just John Doe on the chart, another nameless, faceless patient the system didn't care about. The scans showed a perforated ulcer, serious, but fixable with surgery. The OR was packed that night, but I made the call to bump him up the list. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that everyone deserved a chance. But I also knew the longer he stayed in the ER, the more liability he became. The surgery didn't go as planned. We were understaffed, rushing to get through the cases, and I wasn't as careful as I should have been. I missed something. A small tear in his intestines. By the time we closed him up, sepsis was already setting in. I knew it was bad. He was crashing, his blood pressure dropping fast. And there was no way we'd be able to get him back into the OR in time. He died less than an hour after surgery. I should have reported it. I should have told the truth about what happened, about the mistake I made. But as I stood there looking at his lifeless body, all I could think about was what it would mean for me. A report like that would trigger an investigation. It would go on my record, and I'd be facing malpractice claims for sure. My career would be over. I rationalized it by telling myself that no one cared about him. No family, no friends, no one waiting for him to come home. He was just another John Doe, another statistic in a broken system. So I did it. I signed the death certificate, listing the cause of death as natural causes, septic shock. I didn't mention the surgery, the perforation, or the mistake I'd made. I called the morgue, had him sent down, and told the nurses to move on to the next patient. For a while, I convinced myself it didn't matter. No one came looking for him. No one questioned the death certificate. He was cremated a few days later, his ashes scattered with no ceremony, no marker, no memory of the life he'd lived. But it did matter. I started seeing his face everywhere, in my dreams, in the faces of other patients, in the empty gurney he left behind. I thought about the pain he must have been in during those final moments, the trust he placed in me to save him, and how I failed him. And it wasn't just guilt, it was fear. Fear that someday, someone would find out what I did, that a nurse, a tech, or even another doctor would remember that surgery, that patient, and put the pieces together. It's been years now, and no one ever did. The system is too big, too chaotic. Mistakes like mine get buried under paperwork and indifference. But I've never been able to bury it. I still see his chart in my mind. John Doe, homeless, perforated ulcer. I still hear the flat line of the monitor, the way the nurses looked at me when I called it, and I still feel the weight of the pen in my hand as I signed that certificate, knowing it was a lie. He didn't deserve to die like that, alone, nameless, and failed by the one person who was supposed to help him. I tell myself it was one mistake, one moment of weakness in an otherwise honorable career. But the truth is, it wasn't just one mistake. It was a choice. And no matter how many lives I save now, I'll never be able to undo the life I stole. John Doe may be forgotten by everyone else, but I'll carry him with me for the rest of my life. I've spent most of my life on the road, behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. It's lonely work, but I've always liked the solitude. Just me, my truck, and the long, empty highways. Most nights, I don't even need the radio. Just the hum of the engine and the glow of the headlights slicing through the darkness. But there is one stretch of road I can't drive anymore. 1 mile of pavement that still haunts me, even years later. It was a little after midnight, on a rural highway somewhere in the Midwest. I'd been driving for hours. The kind of long haul where the lines on the road start to blur and your eyelids get heavy. The route was empty. Just an occasional pair of headlights passing me in the opposite direction. I saw him too late. He was standing on the shoulder, waving his arms, trying to flag me down. A hitchhiker. He must have been walking in the ditch and climbed up onto the road just as I came around the bend. I didn't have time to react. By the time I hit the brakes, it was already done. The sound was sickening. Metal hitting flesh. A hollow thud that still echoes in my head. My truck shuddered, and I knew I'd hit him. My heart was racing as I pulled over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely throw the rig into park. I stepped out of the cab, my flashlight trembling in my grip. He was lying in the grass, half on the shoulder, half a ditch. I thought he was dead at first, but then I saw his chest rising and falling, shallow and uneven. His mouth was moving, like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. His face was pale, streaked with blood, and one of his legs was bent at an angle that didn't look natural. I froze. I knew I should have called for help. I should have pulled out my phone, dialed 911, and waited there until an ambulance arrived. But I didn't. I couldn't. I don't know if it was fear, or panic, or just the cold, selfish part of me that cared more about my own life than his. All I could think about was what would happen to me if I stayed. The questions, the paperwork, the investigation, the fines, the charges, the end of my career. So I walked back to my truck. I told myself it was too late for him anyway, that there was nothing anyone could do. I got back in the cab, put the truck in gear, and drove away. For the next few miles, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing lights chasing me down. But the highway stayed dark and empty, as if nothing had happened. I didn't stop until I reached the next rest area. I parked the truck, locked the doors, and sat there in the dark, shaking. My mind was racing with excuses, ways to rationalize what I'd done. He came out of nowhere. It wasn't my fault. He shouldn't have been on the road, but none of it mattered. I'd left him there, bleeding and on the side of the highway. I tried to look for news about it later. Local headlines, police reports, anything. But there was nothing. No mention of a hit and run. No unidentified body found on the highway. It was like he'd just disappeared. I thought maybe I'd gotten away with it, that I could move on and forget about it. But I haven't. I see him every time I close my eyes. The way he looked lying in the grass, his chest barely moving, his lips forming silent words I couldn't or wouldn't hear. And sometimes, when I am out on the road late at night, I see him again, just a glimpse in the shadows, standing on the shoulder, waving his arms, waiting for me to stop. I tell myself it's just guilt playing tricks on me, but it feels real, too real. I don't know if he survived that night or if he died alone in the dark, waiting for help that never came. I don't know if anyone ever found him, if he had a family who wondered what happened to him, if anyone even remembers him at all. But I remember, I'll always remember, and no matter how many miles I drive, I can't outrun the fact that I left him there to die. They say you get used to being around death when you are a caretaker. That's a lie. You don't get used to it. You learn to live with it. You learn to tidy up someone's life, knowing full well they won't need it much longer. You learn to offer smiles that won't be remembered, and hold hands that grow colder every week. What they don't tell you is how the dying have a way of unburdening themselves in their final days. When someone knows they're running out of time, they stop caring about secrets. I thought I had heard it all. Stories about long-lost loves, forgotten feuds, money stolen, lies told. But nothing prepared me for Mrs. Lyle. Edith Lyle was the kind of old woman you'd think twice about crossing. Her eyes were sharp, her voice carried weight, and even in her frailness, she seemed like she could see through you. She lived alone in an aging, cluttered house that smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. I was assigned to care for her twice a week, just basic tasks. Meals, medication, light cleaning. It seemed straightforward enough. At first, she was quiet, observant. She'd sit in her old armchair and watch me work, occasionally offering a curt "thank you," or "don't bother with that." But after a few visits, she started talking. Little things at first. Stories about her youth, her children, her late husband. I learned she'd lived in the same house for over 60 years. She spoke about her younger days, like they were another lifetime. Almost like she was describing someone else's life. As the weeks passed, her stories grew heavier, darker. She'd drift into long silences mid-sentence, as though caught in memories she didn't want to relive. Once, while I was organizing her bookshelf, she asked me if I thought people could ever truly change. I didn't know how to respond, so I just shrugged and said something vague about redemption. That was the first crack. It wasn't long after that when she told me, or maybe confessed is the better word. It wasn't a conversation. It was more like she couldn't hold it in anymore, like it had been festering inside her for decades. It started with a photograph. I'd found it in a box of old keepsakes while tidying up her bedroom. A group of teenagers stood by a riverbank, smiling in the sunlight. Edith was one of them, unmistakable, even in black and white, standing off to the side with a confident, almost defiant posture. I asked her about it, hoping to distract her from the pain she'd been in that morning. Instead, she froze. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might be having a stroke. Then she said, without looking at me, "We were monsters." I didn't know what she meant, but something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I tried to change the subject, but she kept going. Her voice was hollow, distant, like she was reading the words off the inside of her eyelids. She spoke about a boy, James Monroe. He'd moved to town with his family when Edith was a teenager. They were poor and quiet, an easy target for the town's gossip. Edith never really knew him, she admitted, but that didn't matter. Back then, the reasons didn't matter. She described how she and her friends used to taunt him, yell slurs at him in the street. At first, it was just childish cruelty, but it escalated. One summer night, fueled by alcohol and some twisted sense of belonging, her group decided to teach him a lesson. That's how she phrased it. Teach him a lesson. She told me how they dragged him out of his house and into the woods by the river. There were 5 of them, she said. 5 kids who laughed and jeered as they tied a rope around his neck and threw it over a low-hanging branch. I remember her hands shaking as she spoke. She clenched them into fists, her knuckles white, as if trying to hold back the memory. She said he begged. He begged them to stop, begged for his life, but they didn't listen. And then, she said, he was quiet. She didn't cry. My hands felt cold. I wanted to stop her, to tell her I didn't need to know anymore, but I couldn't speak. I just stood there, frozen, while she unraveled her sin. She said the town found him the next morning. The sheriff called it a suicide, and no one questioned it. His family moved away a few months later. No one cared enough to dig deeper. She never saw them again. I asked her why she was telling me this. It was the only thing I managed to say. She looked up at me for the first time since she'd started, her pale blue eyes glistening with tears. "Because it's time," she said. "I've carried this for 70 years, and now it's your turn." I didn't know what she meant at first, but then I realized I was the only one who knew. Everyone else who had been there that night was dead. She'd waited until there was no one left who could hold her accountable. I didn't go back after that day. I called the agency and asked for a reassignment, making up some excuse about needing a change. I couldn't face her again. I didn't even go to her funeral when I heard she'd passed a few weeks later, but she was right about one thing. I can't stop thinking about it. About James Monroe and the life he never got to live. About the look on her face when she told me, about how she said it was my turn to carry her secret. Sometimes I wonder if I should have told someone. Her children. The police, anyone. But what good would it have done? to punish. No one left to blame, just a boy whose life ended in the woods, and an old woman who took that secret to her grave, except she didn't. She left it with me, and now it's mine to carry. I've always believed that plants tell the truth about a person. A lush, thriving garden reflects care, dedication, and patience. A wilted one, neglect, laziness, or worse. For years, my garden was the pride of the neighborhood. Every spring, the tulips in my front yard would bloom in perfect rows, bright reds and yellows that seemed to glow in the sunlight. My roses climbed the trellis in delicate waves of pink and white, and my vegetable patch was the envy of anyone who stopped to admire it. Then the Martins moved in next door. At first, I thought nothing of them. They seemed like a pleasant enough family. Mark, the father, had a firm handshake and a friendly smile. His wife, Julia, was one of those effortlessly elegant types who looked good even when she was pulling weeds. Their kids, Emma and Nate, were polite and well-behaved, always waving hello when they saw me outside. But then I saw their garden. I don't know how they did it, but within months of moving in, their yard looked like something out of a magazine. Perfectly pruned hedges, exotic flowers I couldn't even name, and a vegetable patch that made mine look like a sad afterthought. Mark would joke about how gardening was his stress relief, and Julia would laugh, saying she couldn't keep him away from the yard if she tried. People stopped complimenting my garden. Neighbors, who used to linger by my fence, asking for tips on how to keep their hydrangeas alive, started walking past my yard without a word. I'd hear them raving about the Martins' stunning landscaping and flawless design as they headed down the street. I should have been happy for them, but I wasn't. I was furious. I'd spent years cultivating my garden, and suddenly these newcomers were stealing all the attention. The resentment festered. Every time I saw Mark out there, kneeling in the dirt with his gloves and trowel, I felt it boiling in my chest. Every time Julia brought over a basket of tomatoes or zucchini from their harvest, I had to force a smile. And then one day, I snapped. I don't know what pushed me over the edge. Maybe it was the way Mark smiled as he showed off the climbing jasmine that had taken over their fence, or the way Julia laughed when someone joked that they should enter their yard in a contest. Whatever it was, I decided I'd had enough. I waited until late one night, when the neighborhood was quiet and dark. I mixed up a batch of herbicide, strong enough to kill anything it touched, and slipped into their yard. I told myself I was just going to take out a few plants, just enough to humble them a little. But once I started, I couldn't stop. I sprayed the herbicide on their roses, their vegetable patch, even the base of the old oak tree that shaded their backyard. I worked quickly, my heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and guilt. By the time I was done, their garden looked untouched. But I knew the poison was already sinking in. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about how the poison might spread. A week later, the Martins' garden started to die. It began with the roses. Their leaves turned yellow, then brown, and fell away in clumps. The vegetables were next. The tomatoes shriveled on the vine, the cucumbers wilted, and the lettuce turned to mush. I should have felt satisfied, but I didn't. I felt sick. Then I heard the sirens. It was a Saturday afternoon when the ambulance pulled up next door. I ran outside, pretending to be concerned, and saw Mark carrying little Nate in his arms. The boy was pale, his body limp, as Julia sobbed uncontrollably. They didn't know what was wrong at first. The doctors thought it might have been food poisoning, something he ate from the garden. But then Julia and Emma started showing symptoms too. Nausea, dizziness, muscle weakness. Mark was the only one who didn't get sick. He'd barely eaten anything from the garden, but the rest of his family had. The vegetables I'd poisoned. I remember standing in my yard, watching the paramedics load Nate into the ambulance, knowing exactly what had happened, and knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. Nate didn't survive. He was 5 years old. The doctors eventually traced the poisoning to the vegetables, but they couldn't figure out how it had happened. The Martins hadn't used any chemicals on their plants, and no one did foul play. It was written off as a tragic accident, and the neighborhood mourned alongside them, but I knew the truth. I've never told anyone what I did. Not the Martins, not my friends, not even my therapist. I've spent every day since trying to atone in small, meaningless ways volunteering, donating to charities, planting flowers in the community garden. But nothing will ever bring Nate back. I still see Mark sometimes, out in his yard, trying to revive the garden. He's never been able to make it thrive the way it did before. And every time I see him, I think about the night I poisoned their plants. The night I let my jealousy destroy a family. The guilt is like a vine, wrapping around my chest, tighter and tighter with each passing year. And I know it will never let me go. So, now you've heard them. The secrets, the regrets, and the sins too dark to share in the light of day. What do you think? Are these just stories, or are they glimpses into something deeper? The truth is, everyone carries secrets. Some of us hide them well, while others find release in places like this, anonymous and hidden. If these confessions moved you, made you think, or left you unsettled, let me know your thoughts. What would you do if you found a forum like this? Would you read the secrets? Or would you look away? And if you are brave enough, share your own thoughts in the comments below. Maybe your words will help someone who's carrying the weight of their own hidden truth. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep your secrets close and the light on.